All right.
So we're in business.
All right. Well, here's to another Discord talk, Q&A with Paul. And so I'll start off with the first question. This is from Topher. And a couple weeks ago, Paul, you briefly touched on the metaphor of the pastor as a gardener, who at least partially has the multi-generational view of community health in focus. I was hoping you could expand on that and then also uh, where else? The question of how that is relevant to the emotional fuel of the protests and riots and the health that the pastor is hopefully attending to, if it's not um, too, I guess, subjective is what he's getting at. What is the secret sauce? What is the soil, the water, sunlight, and seeds of a beautiful community?
Wow, that's a big question. If you go to my Twitter or my blog, you'll see um, something to the effect of calling myself a word gardener of the age to come. Some of this language I get from Eugene Peterson. Some of this I get from the Genesis story of Adam and Eve in the garden as gardeners. Part of the reason I use a metaphor like this is in pastoral ministry, pastors don't make things grow. The plants grow because that's how God made them, and there's an environment from which the plants grow. And what pastors tend to do is garden. They tend the plants. Pastors are, it's obviously a shepherding metaphor. They tend the flock, but some of the same things happen with flocks too. The shepherd doesn't make the sheep grow. So that's where that comes from.
Very nice.
Now
So that was
now
like,
the protests. One of the things that I've been thinking about with these protests has been I've been comparing them to the history of protests, the history of the civil rights protests in the American South, which was the it's it's important. We lose a lot of resolution with history. And so if you want to understand the complexity of the American civil rights movement, there was a ton of conflict in what we clump into one thing, the civil rights movement. There were varieties of competing voices that had different strategies. Two of the dominant figures of the time were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And so, just for the sake of fame, it's helpful to compare and contrast those two visions of how social justice and racial reconciliation would be pursued. Dr. King was a pastor, and he was the son of a pastor. And the church, the black church in the South, was the seedbed of that movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a member of the Nation of Islam, which is an entirely different thing. It's important to recognize that both leaders were religious leaders. The Dr. King was there were various streams that influenced Dr. King, including the movement to liberate India from colonial England. And it's helpful to remember some of the history right after World War II. There was a fair amount of unrest in India before the Second World War. Leaders like Gandhi during the Second World War sort of bided their time during that war, but when the war was ended, they began to move. And how could Gandhi make change in India and free it from its colonial overlords, in a sense, and do so peacefully? Well, it was, Gandhi's movement was successful, but there's a really good biography. It's a dual biography of Churchill and Gandhi, and it's worth reading because you sort of see both sides of it. Part of Indian independence was also the fact that, the two world wars basically destroyed England as an empire, as a seagoing empire. And part of why the British Empire unraveled itself was just the changes in economics, the changes in the world. They simply could no longer afford an empire, at least that style of empire. And so Gandhi's pushing and England's retreat were both part of what had happened there. Dr. King learned as he went. He was in his 20s when he sort of got roped into leading the Montgomery bus boycott. And so he was learning as he went, and there were varying voices in the broader movement that were trying to influence Dr. King. He was obviously influenced by his seminary education and his doctoral education at Boston University. So there's a lot that goes into this. When I look at the protests today, Jack Jenkins has recently put out a book on the religious left, and they are having a part to play now, but what we sort of see is something akin to a people movement fueled mostly by images and slogans now on social media, and their capacity to draw large numbers of people who are, in a sense, feeding off of a social religious imaginary to try to express themselves and voice very low resolution demands for change. That's a very different thing than what you discover when you read histories of the movement to liberate India from the British Empire and the movement to change the to get rid of the Jim Crow South legislation. One of the differences is who is tending that garden. Someone like Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor, and he became a movement leader very quickly, was not able to pastor a church because the movement grew too large. But there was pastoring that was going on. There were structures beneath the visible movement where people were known as individuals, and they had self-identity into these churches. In a sense, what sort of happened in the American Civil Rights Movement is it very quickly became parachurch, which became, evangelical in terms of not necessarily the meaning, but the structures. So part of what I struggle with now with this Bridges of Meaning community, a YouTube community, to what degree is it a community? And part of the reason I see what you all are doing on this Discord is you are creating a community. You know each other on a first name basis. And to a degree, I'm doing some pastoring. But when someone called Job the pastor of the discord, that was exactly right, because Job spends a lot more time here than I do, and he and Joey and others pastor this community. So, and they are gardening this community. They don't make the discord grow, but it grows because it's the kind of thing that they are tending. And with the ways that people, again, I've been interested in the ways that other Discord servers are different. The ways that I see Job and others, Shelley, Sherry, many of you who are really in leadership roles here, even though you don't necessarily have titles, and I see how this Discord is different from other Discords, it's because you're all gardening. All right, I gotta use some of these administrative powers that I'm not probably don't have to have. So that maybe hopefully fleshes out the metaphor to see what I mean by that, both in terms of church, but also in terms of the gardening that you all are doing, and you're doing it both as gardeners and as the plants, and pastors do that too. Is that helpful at all, Andrew?
Yeah. Well, Topher isn't here, but
Yeah.
I think I like that answer.
Okay.
So, does anyone have any questions? I think a lot of people here put in questions already in the channel, but I'm just gonna open up for a few seconds. All right. There was one from Andrew K that I think you sort of responded to a bit, but I was wondering if you could maybe. I think it would be interesting for other people to sort of hear it. So Paul has told me about listening being probably the most useful way to convert others in a way. I was wondering that though all the listening you, Paul, do as a pastor, are there times where you tell someone to do something? Is that even worded right? And so I guess, yeah, his question is basically how have you sort of had to change in a way and also had to use that?
Yeah. Here's a rule you learn as a parent: don't make threats you can't follow up on. And what church has become in North America are voluntary organizations. And so what that means is that church discipline, as it was practiced by pastors in the Dominican Republic, as it was practiced by churches in North America before the Second World War, is almost a non-entity. When churches try to discipline someone, well, they'll be gone before any formal discipline can actually take place. And so pastors have very limited means of control in terms of what people will tolerate from them. Now, most pastors understand that, and that has made pastors adopt a far less dictatorial and directive approach. And pastors have sort of migrated to that quietly. There are still churches out there that really like the direct approach, but the church has to be able and willing to follow up on that. Now, there have been times in my ministry when I have basically told someone to do something or there would be a consequence. And most of the time, I will only do it if I know I can guarantee the consequence. But those times are rare. I think this is a huge weakness in the North American church because church discipline is a really helpful tool to help people face things they don't want to face. But that's sort of the way that we're at right now. Because most of the time, giving someone a direct command, do this or what? And you'd better, because once people figure out that your threats are empty, well, then you just look silly. But Jesus and his disciples, there was a lot built into that disciple mechanism where if Jesus would tell his disciples to do something, well, they'd better do it or they're no longer a disciple. There's a great story in the Old Testament when David is thirsty and his men break through enemy lines to bring back, a drink from a stream that David was pining for. And it's a great story because it shows the devotion of David's men to him. And then David feels humbled by their devotion because as a good leader, he did not want his friends risking their life just so they could quench his thirst. And what that taught David was be a little careful about what you say, especially if your followers are really devoted to you. So, it's funny. There was a situation once where we were renting to another congregation, and that congregation, in many ways, it was a black congregation. And again, if you read the beginning of Dr. King's book, when he came to his congregation, one of the first things he did as a black pastor was, make sure that the governing board of the church was fully submitted to whatever vision he would give them. That tends to be the way a lot of black churches work. That's not the tradition of the Dutch Reformed. And being a Dutch Reformed pastor with a lot of African Americans in my church who were raised in black churches, I'm always trying to encourage them to not just be the pastoral yes group, but to tell me what they think. But we were renting to an African American church, and this church was really taking advantage of a number of things. And one of the members of my church who is also a member of another black church. She goes to that black church at an early hour, and then our church later. She was just fed up with me because I didn't enforce a line with these other people. She says, "This would never have happened in a black church." And I said, "That's right." And but my tack with this other pastor was tended to be more patient. In the end, they moved on. They tried things, but we had structured the relationship in certain ways that there were limits to what they could and couldn't do. We never gave them keys to the building, and so we would just say no to things. But it's all a part of working relationships.
Right, very nice. I actually have a question, and I was thinking, this sort of came up when I was going through a conversation with Jonathan Pajot, and I was thinking, do you think an increase in the recognition of symbolism and deeper ideas has increased the need of traditional Christianity denominations and this movement towards some of the older churches, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and I think you've noticed, and I think you noticed this in the conversation when you were talking with Jonathan about this strange movement of some of younger people. I think also Mary Cohan has expressed this expressed the phenomenon of people why would people convert to Catholicism? It's like this old church, why would they do that? And do you think maybe it's a recognition of the symbolism? And I also was thinking about Tolkien and maybe some people noticing that. I mean, for me personally, that was influencing me taking faith more seriously.
That's a good
So,
question. Def is the rise of interest in the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic a function of symbolism, or is the interest in symbolism, also an indicator of the same thing that is beneath the rise in these more sacramental churches? I, so I was looking at on YouTube. It was serving me up some videos of, I think it was Bishop Fulton Sheen, which in some ways was the Bishop Barron before Bishop Barron. And he gave his talks on stage with his vestments and the crosses. And I, as a dyed in the wool lowish church Protestant, look at that and think of Liberace. And it's like I don't think I would ever do that sort of thing. I think the desire for symbolism, the desire for much more deeply liturgical and sacramental churches, is a function of the declining modernism. And again, you can see this in architecture. What is modernist architecture? What is modernist furniture? People are hungering to live in an enchanted world. That's what Tolkien offered. That's what Lewis offered. And symbolism is in some ways the native language of that enchantment. So I'm not at all surprised at the the movement towards those denominations. I think it's also important to note that these denominations are highly hierarchical. The priest reports to his bishop, the bishop to his archbishop, the archbishops to the cardinals to the pope. That's in the opposite spectrum of seeker-style, non-denominational congregations. These things aren't accidental, these different elements, but they're all symbolic of different aspects. And again, this is where Peugeot is so powerful. Different aspects of reality in this way. There's a reason the Protestant Reformation happened and took the directions it did. Some of those things were important ways to try to address things in the church. Other things are lamentable from it. So I think what we're seeing in this movement towards the sacramental, the symbolic, is part of the natural cycling, if you were, of this of the church. And I think the church is stronger. I think a lot of people, there are many. So we look at Roman Catholic and Orthodox and we imagine, well, there's that, but there's astounding diversity within the Roman Catholic Church, which I would know better than the Orthodox. There are orders. There are different churches that practice different rites. The different rites have different traditions. So there's tremendous diversity there. But now, in terms of churches in the world, there's astounding diversity. So I see this as just sort of part of the process of our culture, readjusting from the excesses of modernism while hopefully not losing some of its powers.
All right. And since you sort of brought in Sacrament, Falcon Dark had a question that sort of touched on that. Um, this question is, in your recent video on critical theory, you talked about how a sacrament is something material that connects us to something immaterial. Can you explain what you mean when you say that meaning is a sacrament for Jordan Peterson, given that meaning is immaterial? Or what is the immaterial thing that Jordan Peterson is trying to connect?
That's a great question. That's a great question and a fair point to make on my observation. When I say meaning is Jordan Peterson's sacrament, I should probably say the experience of meaning. Because the experience of meaning is not meaning itself. And, I think John Vervaeke, gosh, he's colonized me in all sorts of ways. Meaning is one of these many things that is transjective, as he would say. Back and forth. And so meaning, but so what's our side of it? The experience of meaning. And so when Jordan Peterson says, do what is meaningful, not what is expedient, that experience of meaning functions sacramentally. So I'd have to alter what I say there, because there's a sacrament itself. Then you could push and say, well, is the host, the wafer, the bread, and the wine, are those sacraments, or are they functioning sacramentally for us? So sacraments are, in my tradition, are signs and seals. Are signs and seals material? The dollar bill is a sacrament to the dollar. So yeah, fair question, and thanks for the chance to nuance it. I hope that clears it up. It's the experience of meaning that functions sacramentally in Jordan Peterson's system.
All right. So the next one is from Annemiek, and what do you see going forward with the IDW movement? Are there any potential developments that either excite or worry you?
Well, first question is going to be what on earth is the IDW? Because and this might be totally unfair and maybe demonstrates my ignorance. Eric Weinstein names it, but Jordan Peterson embodied it, I think. And to the degree that the IDW, at least what I think of as the IDW, I haven't seen anyone embody it the way that Jordan Peterson did. And so what Jordan Peterson can do in the future, I think, is deeply tied to whatever it is we mean by this. And okay, so what do I mean by IDW? One aspect is clearly the capacity to have, as my friend Rod Hare says, 10% conversations. The capacity to have conversations across culture war battlefields that are productive. So if we define the IDW in that way, then in some ways John Vervaeke's project is very much included and at the heart of the IDW. If we define the IDW as pushing back on, well, what exactly are we pushing back on? Is it postmodernity? Is it critical theory? Is it political correctness? Is it the tyrannical left? If that's the IDW, then Glenn Loury and John McWhorter, in my opinion, are two of its brightest lights, and very much would include Eric and Brett Weinstein in that number, and many, many others. When I think of the IDW, though, it includes at least the at least the appreciation and fear, in the fear of the Lord type sense, fear of the religious layer. And Eric has teased at that. Brett has pointed to it briefly. I think Ben Shapiro is too bought into the political aspect roles that he's playing. Jordan is the only one I saw. Well, John Vervaeke too, but of course John comes at it in different ways. I mean, Jordan did something different, and he was willing to skirt lines that make a lot of, well, and to say, it would be unfair to say that John Vervaeke isn't skirting those lines too. Jordan is skirting those lines with Christianity in some very peculiar ways, and so my understanding of the IDW really centers around Jordan Peterson, and so its future is tied to Jordan. And I think my evidence for this is the fact that when Jordan went silent, the IDW sort of disappeared, because we needed a name for Jordan that wasn't Jordan. And I think Eric has a tremendous gift of articulating and naming things, and I think with his IDW idea, he named it.
Nice. So I'm going to go, Carlos actually had a follow-up question from the church discipline question, and that is, how similar do you think this is easy divorce contributing to breakdown of marriages, as spouses can avoid their spouse instead of facing them with the consequences? So, try to remember exactly.
Yeah. There's no thing studied that has generated more study committees in the history of the Christian Reformed Church than divorce and remarriage. This is an issue that was brought to Jesus. That's 2,000 years ago. Jesus commented on Moses' treatment of it. That was, maybe 1,200 years before Jesus? Marriage is one of these hot spots. And so, geologically there are these hot spots. Like one of them is below Yellowstone National Park. Marriage is one of these hot spots. And because I think many of the structural elements that make people run through marriage. And this is why I can completely understand why in the Roman Catholic tradition it's a sacrament. Because when you look at how Paul talks about it in the book of Ephesians, marriage is sacramental, even though it's marriage material. Gosh, see, this stuff all gets hard. So, someone here sent the living Hitchens brother. It's not Christopher, it's his brother. Anyway, he had a talk in the Oxford Commons on marriage and no-fault divorce. There was a whole new argument I had never heard before, but it really had traction. Marriage symbolizes the height of human unity, and so therefore in some ways embodies the heart of our struggle. And so in many ways the capacity of a culture to do marriage well, and doing marriage well is always aspirational, I think could be an element of indication of that culture's capacity to do life well. It's just that powerful. And so I've long believed that the real crisis in American marriage is not about gays. That's in many ways a sideshow. I agree with Hitchens on that point. Because the heteros long messed up marriage before, the gays got a chance to participate. But at least as such in terms of same-sex marriage. But no, that's right. It's right there. And the fact that we struggle with marriage is indicative of a whole lot of other things in our worlds.
Okay. And this is also from Carlos. This is a little bit before, though. One weak point often brought up by people converting away from Catholicism is bad sermons. Nowadays, I and many people I know listen to sermons online, both from Catholic and Protestant preachers. To what extent do you think the availability of sermons online on demand is contributing to neo-sacramentalism? Perhaps people being able to get their preaching fix online are now able to spend time offline looking for the smells and bells.
Wow, I think that's exactly right. I never thought of that. That's one I'm gonna rob. I think that's so true. I think it's so true. That there's a balance, and if you're actually organizing worship services, you're always dealing with that balance. There's so many things have to happen in a worship service, and they have to happen efficiently and within a time frame. So churches in the Dominican Republic would go for 3 or 4 hours on a Sunday morning. Black churches in America, you'll be at church all morning. You'll eat together. You'll be together. They'll be preaching. They'll be singing. You're going to have time for everything. Now that people are, we've only begun learning about the ways that these technical innovations are changing the church, and COVID is going to be a big piece of that. But Carlos, I think you're dead on right on this point, and because, yeah, you can. Jonathan Peugeot made a point in one of his question and answers about this. He said, part of the reason I go to an Orthodox church is that the priest can be an idiot, and but he's doing the liturgy, and so if I got to suffer through a lousy 5-minute homily, I can handle that because the rest of the service is locked in and reliable. Well, Protestants are managing that in a different way. Everybody flocks to the church with the successful preacher. Now via YouTube and podcasts and other things. I remember with my grandmother, this was in the 1980s, when she was getting elderly and getting to church wasn't really a possibility anymore. She went to the Church of Charles Stanley. So, yeah, these things are changing, but I think that's a great observation, Carlos. I'm going to steal that thing, because I think that's dead on right.
Yeah. So a few more people have joined. Anyone want to voice a question over the channel? I'll take the silence as no. I'll go to Luby Lee, and she says, loving the LGBT series and curious to see where you might end up without having any fear or favor of what that might be. And so if you had one question to ask the other side of specific issues you're trying to untangle or challenge, you would pose. So what would the question be?
It's funny because everybody, when we look at, okay, where will I end up, and what people usually mean by that is Am I going to be for it or against it? Well, for what or against what? Well, and see, this is what happens in church leadership things, where we have to establish a policy. What will we permit? What won't we permit? And that's a function of that type of thing. I'll tell you where I'll end up. I'll end up by saying every individual is going to have to come to some sort of determination about how they will act when the particularities of the situation calls them to act. And so, on previous things I mentioned that I've got this cover from Christianity Today on the wall of my office of Ted Haggard, because he of course had this huge scandal with the top. This is when before his fall, a new kind of evangelical, and there he is just smiling on the cover. And so I put that up just as a sacrament of humility for pastors, that we all have feet of clay. We are all broken people. People look at a situation and say, well, here's Paul, and he's got a YouTube channel, and what Paul says about the LGBT stuff will influence people, and that is right. But finally, each of us has to figure out what to do with ourselves sexually. And how will we do that? I think one of the things that you look at I think C.S. Lewis said it right. I think the Christian ideal for sexuality is a man and a woman together in marriage. That's the ideal. And being fruitful and multiply and bearing young, that's the ideal. That's aspirational, both in terms of our capacity to live it out. Some people are sterile, some people are past menopausal, some people are on and on and on and on. And it's aspirational, especially about our ability to fulfill the image. There are many ways that I've failed. I've been a failure in my marriage. I'm certainly not alone on that score. We all have to live with that. And so part of the series is the desire to explore the questions without necessarily delivering. And Paul Vanderklay, by his authority, says, you should do this. Well, anybody listening to my video, I probably don't know them well enough to be able to speak directly into their lives. So I want to give them as much light as I have, but they're the ones that have to make their decisions, because yes, I will be held to account by God for the teachings I give, but each of us will be called to account to God for the things that we do. And one of the really interesting things about the New Testament is that almost all the final judgment passages in the New Testament refer to not things that we think, not simply things that we profess, but things that we do. Even Matthew 25, as much as you have done this, Jesus says. So each of us have a whole bunch of things going on in the area of sexuality, whether you're same-sex attracted or however flexible or reliable the direction of your attractions are. And that's where I'll end up. That we're all this is the information we have. I'll try and make as much of it as available as I can with whatever perspectives I have, but each of us are called to give an account for what we do with our bodies and how we treat other people. Now the second part of that question was quite a bit more complicated.
Do you want me to
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, it's just sort of, uh, if you were, if you had one question to ask the other side on a specific issue that you're trying to untangle or challenge, how would you pose it or pose it to?
Well, I guess part of my answer is that I don't necessarily I understand that there are sides, but all of the sides are contextual within certain frames, and so the frame will determine what the sides are, and which would determine the question. Because are you for or against same-sex marriage in the church? Well, the only place I would probably be called upon to answer that question would be in a specific chair, in a specific room, with a specific manifestation and instantiation of the church. It could be a council meeting. It could, and I've sat in enough of those meetings to know that all of the yes or no things that create sides are deeply nested with many, many particularities that impact the answer I would give. And I know for a lot of people that says, well, that sounds, well, you're trying to straddle. Not trying to straddle. Um, when Prop 8 was landed in California, I voted. When I go to CRC Synod, I vote. But I vote according to the proposal that is on the agenda, and I vote yes or no. And the frustration is that once things get to that level, well, there's a whole lot of other stuff built in. And when I sit down with someone who is wrestling with their sexual activities, their sexual appetites, their sexual the table setting that is before them, most of the questions I deal with are, and this is shaped by, okay, I'm in a non-affirming denomination. They deal with husbands and wives that are trying to be faithful to one another, husbands and wives that perhaps are dissatisfied with their sexual opportunities as they line up with their sexual appetites and needs. The diversity in those fields are astounding. And so what is more common across all of these lines is that we have unmet needs, we have desires that are not being met, and in almost every case, the grasp that we have on what exactly is going on with us on those realms is pretty difficult and very individual. So how I would vote in a particular synod is one thing, and sitting in an office and talking to an individual as they have invited me into their life to figure things out, it's a whole different thing. And so I take the things as they come.
All right. So, next question. Pastor Paul, what do you do when you're depressed, upset, or feeling down from the things of the world? Do you just pray to God and get over it, or something else? How is that process?
Well, the kicker in that question is from the things of this world. Sometimes I just have to get off Twitter and stop listening to YouTube videos and change the diet of what I direct my attention towards. So if the things of that internet world are getting me down, it's relatively easy to turn that off because I can just sort of close that door. In my experience, different people have, and Jonathan Haidt talks about this, I think, nicely in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis. Certain people are just temperamentally happy. I look at that in my family. My youngest son is temperamentally happy in a lot of ways. I think he got that from me. My wife, as is common, I think is a little higher in neuroticism than I am. She worries more. I do get depressed sometimes, and sometimes the depression seems to be because I'm not eating right, I'm not exercising, I'm not getting enough sleep, or it's because I'm not attending to some things that I'm avoiding, and so I'm carrying those things on me instead of attending to them and relieving the anxiety. Some of the times in my life when I have been most depressed have been times when there have been relationships and circumstances that I could not change. I was stuck, and they were really eating on me, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure on me. There was a time when I began to discover myself having anxiety attacks. I had never had any of those before. And I was basically going into shock, and I would crawl in a warm day in Sacramento. I would crawl under the covers of my bed, fully clothed, shivering because I was in shock. And there were some very difficult things in my life at that point that I had to deal with, that went on for years. And I, for various reasons, it was difficult for me to take advantage of mental health professionals. I never took any kinds of antidepressants or anything like that. But what I did was I developed some practices that I found to be effective. I found music to be very effective. And I'd have playlists of songs that I knew would calm me down. And those songs were almost always of a Christian religious nature. John Michael Talbot, Michael Card. And I could either put on a blindfold or go into a dark room and be by myself, practice some intentional breathing, and slow down my autonomic nervous system to get that under control. And then, of course, the shivering would stop. And I've also have the benefit of being someone who, when I get very stressed out, I sleep. And again, I think this is just a function of more of how I'm wired. And I know a lot of people, when they're very stressed out, they can't sleep. And that's an additional problem. So, but almost all of this for me involves prayer and scripture. And so I will put on the Bible in audio form, and I will listen to Christian music, and I will pray, and I will cry out to God. And that is my practice. But it has to also involve often diet and exercise and getting enough sleep and attending to the things in my life that I'm avoiding. So that's how that works for me.
So, and Meek also just asked this question: what have you seen an uptick in members of your congregation or community dealing with mental illness over the course of your ministry? And if so, how have you dealt with it?
I live with the term mental illness, but I don't like it. And I don't like it because I think it exacerbates an important line. But I remember talking to a clinical psychologist that I was working with. I have been in therapy at different times in my life. I was working with this clinical psychologist. He had a PhD. He's quite well known and respected. He's a Christian psychologist in this community. And I was asking about a situation, asking if it was psychiatric or psychological. And he said that question in many cases doesn't matter. because you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference. And that just shows how complex we are. I see a lot of insurance companies like to prescribe medication because it's cheaper than seeing a psychologist. Seeing a psychologist can be very expensive and sometimes psychology well done means weekly or multiple trips to the psychologist. That's going to be hundreds of dollars a week for years. Insurance companies don't want to pay that. I'm not seeing the members of my church right now. That's a real problem. And I'm a little concerned when we start doing services what some of these individuals will look like. How much has this lockdown cost them? A lot. Well, that has to be balanced on the other side of how much would catching COVID cost them? Well, potentially their lives. So that's what we're dealing with. People in my congregation who have been diagnosed and perhaps are on disability because of mental health diagnoses, they are suffering. And, but is it, some of them, statistically speaking, can probably weather the infection if they get it. Would it be better for them to just get it and be done with it? If that is in fact the case, I don't know. So, yeah, people are struggling. But on one hand, I believe in psychiatry and I believe in psychology. I'm just not always sure we know where that line is, and often it doesn't matter. And so, try psych meds? Okay. Try talking therapy? Okay. Exercise, diet, good friends and relationships around you. Oh, there's a lot of sanity in that.
Yeah. So Dave has asked this question. I'm an Orthodox Christian, but my favorite preacher is a Calvinist from Sacrament. Many others on this Discord are in various traditions or no tradition, but still seem to be drawing wisdom from others in a sort of cross-pollination. To what extent do you see this as an example of a growing ecumenical openness in the larger culture that still recognizes and respects the differences between Christian traditions? Or do you see this more as a niche movement within this corner of the internet?
I think you all are the front edge. I think ecumenism is happening, and these technologies both afford and they give and they take away. And I think about Carlos's observation that this has been happening for a while. So my friend Rod in Tucson, he's much more direct than I am as a pastor. But the shape of his church affords that. That's really key. So the pastor, the gardener gardens by virtue of the nature of the garden. So for a while, Rod had people coming to his church saying, we'd like to have our small group be a part of your church, and so use your facility, but we do our Sunday mornings in this other church that's probably had a gifted pastor and the kind of music they like and so on and so forth. And Rod basically said, jump in a lake. If you're a part of this community, you stick with this community. Now, he's not telling people to take other people off their podcast and YouTube sessions, but he expressed a reality that we ought to be committed to a local community. And I think that's right. I suspect the different denominations and traditions started in different times and places, and I suspect partly because there was a need in the kingdom of God for certain things to get addressed in the church. Brad Gregory is a historian. I think he teaches at Notre Dame. He's written a book that I've read and a Great Courses series where he goes into the Protestant Reformation. He's an expert of that. And the Protestant Reformation made the Roman Catholic Church better. I think the Orthodox, the flowering of Orthodoxy in North America is making the church overall here better. And you all are beneficiaries of that. So, I'm struggling right now because I'm looking at apps for our church because I need a way for our seniors to be able to connect with us online, and I need a way to open up I need a way to open up giving online so that people that like what I do can, it's lovely that people support me on Patreon, but could really support Living Stones more easily. So I'm working on that. And so on one hand, I want to tell people who enjoy the work that I do, thank you. But please go to a local church. And if there's room in your life to also participate in this community, do so too. And that will vary according to what people need and the time they have available to them. And the ways that, it could be that your local Orthodox church can't do anything online because they're Orthodox and they're not good in that space. But they're a vital, vibrant community. Invest in that community. If you have time in your life to invest in this weird little cyber church we have going on Discord, invest there too. And let God lead you. And let him, and again, the bulletin secretary of my church she came to me once kind of sheepishly and says, is it okay to be members of two different churches at the same time? What am I going to say? No? It's like, she goes to, when we had services, she goes to both services. She's worked for them. She works for us. She's a vital member of both congregations. She's got that much desire and capacity that one church can't do it all for her. So I think this is the cutting edge of a new ecumenism.
Very nice. Yeah. I don't know if you answered this question last time, but it's from Jacob, and I'll just say it if you answered it or not. I've been thinking about people who come up with rationalizations for the most evil things by turning towards religion. How do we know if we are doing that when an interpretation is legitimate as opposed to a rationalization of what we wanted to do anyway? I
get the question. The same question this same question plagues us on many, many different fronts. How do I know when? It's basically how can we know? It's in some ways the monarchical vision question. How can I see the world as it is? How can I do what's right? Well, there's lots of different wisdom, and I think that's the best way to approach it, given by the Bible, given by the history of the church, and I could, most of it, almost all of you will recognize. Pray, seek out wise counsel, be devoted to the scriptures, try to be honest with yourself, have a group of friends around you who know you well and can speak into your life. Try to listen to them. And the question which posits evil things, That's always degrees of that too. And so we might get frustrated hearing all of these answers because they all sound so pat. They're so common. We don't, there's so many. The thing is, too, that as age confers wisdom, partly because sometimes whether you got something right or wrong is only revealed in time. And this is part of the reason why the Christian tradition of repentance and forgiveness is so vital, because we'll get a lot wrong. I remember when I moved to Grand Rapids, there was a pastor who had known my father from the Patterson days, because this guy had lived in New York City, and I remember when I met him, oh, you're Stan's son. He was happy to meet me, and we had a good relationship. But I remember him telling me something to the effect that he felt that my father had, I don't know any of the details of the situation. He felt that my father had done him wrong in one particular way, which I seldom heard that about my father. People loved my father, but my father was not a perfect man, and it was just interesting to me that this other pastor, who became a mentor and a friend, at least to the degree that I knew him, thought to bring that up to me. And I think he thought to bring that up to me because he was processing it, and probably processing, was Stan right in what Stan did or wrong? I'll tell you that if you're a pastor or a husband or a father or a son, anyone who has any agency, who acts in the world, you go back and look at the decisions you made and think, was I right in this? And I think, I guess, the last thing I'd add to that list of wisdom is, be careful of what you do when you're really emotional about things. Because anger, enthusiasm, pathos, that can overwhelm our critical functions quite easily. So sleep on it, take some time, pray, study scripture, listen to the church, read church history. It's all the wisdom stuff. And then when you do evil, confess and see if you can make up for it.
Very nice. I think there's a few more people in the voice, so I'd like to open it up to anyone who wants to express their question over voice, or if they have a follow-up to what Paul just said. All right. So this wasn't directly a question, but I think I found it interesting. I think you might as well. It's from Brandon, and he said, I think Christianity is a great path to a sense of freedom. I'm not Christian, but the idea that you are completely free because you think you know the truth and are born again with a clean slate, and your business in life is to do your best to keep that slate clean. That's very liberating.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah. And people are anxious about, especially of Protestantism, because sometimes people look at it and say, that's a cheap get out of jail free card. You mean to tell me that if you just admit that you sinned, then you can be forgiven without undoing the damage that your sin had caused? Well, first of all, Christianity talks about true repentance, whereas we all understand the difference between saying you're sorry and true repentance. And so true repentance is always costly. And the next thing is that so often we wrong people in ways that we can't fix it. We can't make up for it. We do that all the time. A cruel word, or even a truthful word said for bad reasons, can cause tremendous damage, and it can't be undone. But then we get to the other point that the process of the process of dealing with that can sometimes yield, like Eric Weinstein's idea of superpositions, can sometimes yield superpositions where you said something to this other person that was hurtful and wrong, and you're forced to realize it, and you have to go to that person, and that person may or may not be accept your request accept your apology. If they do, and well, now there's potential for something different in the relationship. So I understand people's. It's a very strange thing, because is Christianity just deciding to pray the sinner's prayer? Yeah, it is. But it isn't too. It isn't either. And there's a lot of life that's like that. So, yeah, no, I get that. I get that, Brendan. I get that. And then, who's a Christian? Well, a lot of people, especially in this world, in this discord, well, I'm not a Christian because I don't believe. Okay? Well, someone could easily say to me, you're not a Christian because you're not obedient. Well, what do you mean I'm not obedient? Well, here's 3 things you're not obedient in. Okay. Fair enough. Finally, it's God who knows his own. and we do the best we can at knowing ourselves.
Yeah. So I'm just going to open it up again to anyone if they have any questions.
I have one if no one else has one.
Yeah, go for it, Valerie.
Okay. How did you become such a good listener to people? I see you listening to all these different conversation partners, and you interview people, and you obviously are a pastor for a long while. How did you gain that skill?
Like you gain most skills by doing it badly and finding the results. I've had in my pastorate a short list of individuals who would come into my office whenever they'd feel like it and sit across from me and just start talking. And I, in some ways, was a kind of a prisoner of them in some ways. Yeah, I could have showed them out the door. Yeah, I could have done that stuff. But and so then I had a lot of time to listen to people. And as I listened, the more I listened, and then I'd try different things, try saying this one thing, try giving advice, try doing that, try doing this. Then watching the results, it's very scientific. Watching the results, the more I would watch how this thing would go, the more I'd realize that I was often too active and that I should do more listening. And I'm a Budinsky. I'm not naturally a good listener, and so it's been something that I've had to learn, and I still fail at it. But it's one of these things that comes with age, and to the degree that I do it well, that's basically what I can say.
Thank you.
All right, Paul. I have a second question for you, actually.
Okay.
I was thinking about ecumenical sort of conversation. I was thinking about this Discord, and you were talking about Jonathan Pajot, and you were talking with him about ecumenical conversation, I was thinking, is it likely that we are being forced, if we aren't already, to have more ecumenical dialogue by the pressures of secularism, atheism, anti-theism, modernity?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the Christian Reformed Church used to be pretty rabidly anti-Catholic in some ways. A lot of that changed because of the abortion issue in America. I think a lot of that changed because of a lot of it changed because people just started knowing each other better, and some of the cheap stereotyping that would happen, just people learned was just not true. And I remember in the 80s, people would say, I have this Catholic friend, and they read the Bible. Well, that's because somewhere along the line, someone told them Catholics don't read the Bible. Was that true? And so, there's just we don't live as ghettoized as we used to, and alignments form and allyships form because other things come up. So, yeah. The ecumenism is being forced on the church again. And I think part of that is because secular governments have become the norm. It's a different thing when your government is Roman Catholic or Lutheran or Calvinist than when your government says, I'm not taking a position. So, yeah. But I think it's a good thing.
That part where you talked about reading the Bible made me laugh a lot.
Yeah.
As a Catholic, I'm not very biblically literate, and recently I've been reading through some passages. That just it still sort of is, I think, sometimes a stereotype though, because we work on tradition a lot as well. So instead of just always going directly through the Bible, I don't have any other questions queued. So,
okay.
If anyone has any voice questions, but I think I've gotten through all the Thursday questions.
Good. We don't have to go 2 hours. By no means. I mean, because we're going to do this all again tomorrow. So,
round two.
Round two. So, yep. Any last chance at a question? Otherwise, we'll.
Yeah, there's one. Or I think someone just unmuted themselves. If anyone has a.
Oh, now they're coming in.
Jeff, do you have a question? I have
a question, but I don't want to keep you extra long, Paul, because I have a feeling this could lead to a long answer and a long discussion.
I budgeted 2 hours, so we're within the budget, and I am leaving at 6 because I have a council meeting at 7. So, fire away, Jeff, if you have it.
First of all, are we being recorded? Because I need to be careful about how I phrase.
Yes, we are being recorded.
All right. I came to this late, so I apologize if this has already been discussed. Has the whole race issue national conversation come up in today's Q&A?
No, not much.
Okay. Well, I personally have just been wrestling with this whole thing on different fronts. Paul, you know this. I don't know how many. Well, I'm being recorded. I'm not going to talk about that. So one of the things that I'm struggling with is in the denomination that I go to right now of church. It's called the Wesleyan denomination. I think in its current form, it's been around since like the early 60s. And one of the things that I particularly enjoy about it is it seems it's moderate enough to where the left-leaning stuff that I encounter doesn't irritate me too much, because there's right-leaning stuff to counterbalance it, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But just of late, at least 3 pastors in the denomination who are scattered across the country, but that I've met in being in this church for over a decade now, have really started to, actually some pastors that I really admire have really started to take on a lot of the anti-racist, I guess, religiosity, I guess, as John McWhorter would call, anti-racism its own religion. And it's just, I'm just wrestling with it because it's so difficult, and it's hard for me to articulate this conversation, or this question, or whatever it is that I'm saying right here, but I just find myself, to maintain my sanity right now, just diving into any time that Glenn Loury and John McWhorter post anything, just to hear at least a more complete perspective on the whole discussion. And I don't really have a question, it's just a comment, and I'm just interested what your thoughts on all that are.
I think number one, try hard to not lose your patience with people who are using the boilerplate, the language boilerplate that is being distributed, because that they are well intentioned, they are sincere, but even if I disagree, and even if I am much more persuaded by Loury and McWhorter's takes on these things, we should be patient with the pastors and denominations and businesses that are doing these things. They truly mean well. At the same time, I very much understand and experience your frustration, because and I think it's helpful to take a step back and understand what is happening. And again, this is a good lesson in how people work, and it's a sobering lesson when we realize, well, is this how we're working too? So these people are following Ta-Nehisi Coates, or can list a whole bunch of other people who are scripting. Abram X, I forget his last name. The people who are Robin DiAngelo. I mean, stuff. This is how people work, and people believe in tribes, and people get their cues. And so, what we in the nation have for a long time is we say, well, let's look at the guiding lights in any individual thing. So whether it's a medical doctor from Harvard, or an economist from Harvard, or a physicist from Harvard, or a mathematician from Harvard, once you have Harvard there's a degree of authority and reliability that is presupposed. Now, many of us have been involved in a conversation. We've been influenced by the likes of Jordan Peterson and McWhorter and Loury to think differently on this. We ought to have patience with those who disagree with us. That's a general rule. And if we would like to have influence, we ought to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. So engage with people in, it's so funny because in the Vervaeke space here, we're talking dialogos, and well, maybe we think we're only going to use these tools with the nice people like Sam, who's who's non-Trinitarian, and the adversaries and our friends on the Discord, and okay, fair enough. But that's kind of a sandbox. We're playing at it. When it comes to engaging leaders in the denomination, sometimes if we do so as white individuals disagreeing with black leaders, that's scary, because unless you toe the party line, you will be called racist. And then I would say, well, number one, are you a racist? We ought to check ourselves. Number two, finally, you do work before an audience of one. And so all of this stuff that we talk about in Christianity, about loving enemies, about not wrestling against flesh and blood, about all of this is most needed when someone is doing something that we feel is damaging and dangerous and actually putting the world at risk. So now's the time to practice what we preach, and that practicing and preaching is loving our enemies. And, well, would we like to have influence? Then it gets really tricky, because then we have to ask ourselves, how can we be influential with people with whom there's a disagreement and there's a lot of emotion in the room? Some of that might mean keeping silent for a while, biding your time, and when trust me, there'll be another incident that grabs the zeitgeist, which, well, it'll probably be racialized, because just about everything is now, but it won't be as directly so. Perhaps then will be the time to make a point or learn a language or all of these things that we're doing. So now is when we learn to practice these things. Don't pick stupid fights. If this stuff is driving you crazy, step away, take a bath, watch a Netflix show, put your mind on something else, and because right now it's hot and heavy, but the thing about truth is that it's the truth and it's durable, and so give things time, and then do the winsome promoting of better ideas when you have space and opportunity. That's about the best we can do.
Jeff, do you have anything else?
Oh, no, just a thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. I just want to make sure we get this question in. It was sort of a follow-up from Falcon Dark about Jordan Peterson. So what do you think is the immaterial thing that Jordan Peterson is trying to use the sacrament of experience, or of the experience of meaning, to connect us to, or to connect to, sorry?
I think Peter, I often describe it as sort of an internal gyroscope that we have. We have this experience of meaning that when we experience it, when we watch it vicariously in others, in movies and stories, we have it when, I was mowing the lawn and I get done and I look out at the lawn and it looks good. Boy, that's meaningful. I cleaned my room. I didn't really, but I need to. Boy, that's meaningful. And Peterson, just as a really pragmatic, wise clinical psychologist who has worked and helped with a lot of people and worked with students, says, when you feel that, that's telling you something. Keep seeking more of that. And that feeling is a little different kind of reward than eating that ice cream cone or watching that self-indulgent movie or posting that, going to battle on social media against all the SJWs. And he's saying, here you have these different experiences. Opt for the meaningful. And that will, basically the whole point of maps of meaning is that this is built into us. This is built into us to work correctly. It's really very much a natural law argument. And, let your conscience be your guide. Well, your conscience has developed in you for reasons. And so he's just basically encouraging people that experience. Now, it's sacramental in that it is, in fact, for him, an indication of leading you towards a better world. Now, again, my critique of this, which others have made, is that, well, people, if you were a communist, starving the Ukraine, well, sacrifices need to be made for the glorious revolution to move forward. Or if you're a ardent Nazi prison guard, well, we're getting rid of the Jews will allow the natural order to once again reassert itself, and the world will be a better place. All those things feel meaningful too. So it's not a vouchsafe perfect indicator, but given where most people are at today, it's a pretty good place to start. I don't know if that answered your question well enough. It's that feeling you have when you cleaned your room, or cut the lawn, or got an A on the test, or did that chore for your mother. That's that feeling, and he says, notice when you get that feeling, and do more of that. That's good advice.
Yeah, he's typing right now, so maybe he'll have a follow-up.
Yeah.
All right, and there is another from Owen. One of your talks of spirits, principalities seems very Girardian, for whom the demon unclean spirit is the particular mutual psychic possession one of another, and the Satan is the distributed, pervasive, individual psychology. This moves Jesus' ministry from relevant to fringe demonic phenomena to an engagement with the psychological, sociological world on a most compelling manner. Do you have thoughts on the ontology of the spirits and powers? To me, the psyche is existing, and the spirit is real and has real life, even if it is psyche and dies if exorcised from the possessed. Also, can you talk about both whiteness and whiteness studies as principalities and relate them to our perceptual lenses by which the world stands out to us and which organizes the objects of perception?
I was listening to the Rebel Wisdom video where the dude was in his retreat through the pandemic and came out of it to find the world turned upside down. And again, now almost any time I hear someone use the word real, a little subcommittee of my Consciousness Congress pauses, pulls that usage aside, and examines it. What do we mean by this word real? I think it means the things which finally win in the end. Well, what do we mean the end? Is there an end? Well, that all is dependent on the narrative arc of the story. Karen and Michael had a terrific conversation on Karen's channel about story that I posted here. We have this problem in that a lot of modernity is still with us. And I remember my second conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, I really wasn't understanding as well spirits and principalities in terms of what he was talking about. And so that took time for me to sort of grasp the conception of it that I have now. See, the ontology of spirits and powers, the psyche absolutely exists. I mean, I don't. Now, here's the thing: who are we talking to? Are we talking to Sam Harris? Sam Harris. I mean, all these materialists are cheating like crazy as modernity washes away. Daniel Dennett says there's matter and information, and it's like, huh, you just gave up the game, Dan Dennett. And when Sam Harris uses the intersubjective, well, he's trying to get at the spiritual by saying, well, here is the thing that is in both people's minds at the same time, as if he understands what that means. And I don't think we do. And again, my go-to illustration of that lately has been school spirit. School spirit is, I think, the usage of the word that we use now that is apt, and almost all of us, at least in the American context, can understand what we're talking about. And we can easily see how, let's say, everyone who has gone to this particular high school has died, and the school district is no longer using this building, and for somehow it's been abandoned perhaps, and let's say I walk into this building. I can have a sense of that school spirit. The years of decay have added onto the school spirit. Now, this gets tricky because let's say we look at the story of Jesus and the demoniac, the demon talks back and gives a name. Modernists are skeptical about that. To me, I think that is a bias of data. Why should we be skeptical of that? So here's a question. Is there a realm in which spirits occupy that we don't have access to in the way that I have access to the how many different items sitting here in my office? Well, quite obviously, where does school spirit reside? Where does the spirit of C.K. McClatchy High School reside, or Eastern Christian? So, yeah, real enough to... I use this illustration all the time. Uncle Sam is real enough to make us pay our taxes and go and vote and care about politics. And when you look at the way Paul talks, well, is there a spirit in the? Are all the spirits that manifest in the world that we know off the shelf? Or do human beings create new spirits as we travel through history? I would guess we sort of create new spirits. The spirit of Uncle Sam was born and has been growing and might even die. I don't find I'm violating the language when I speak that way. So, but yet when we have things like spiritual possession and demons, well, these seem to be in some ways far older spirits than we are, and they can interact. C.S. Lewis says we're amphibious, and I think that's sort of a good metaphorical way of thinking about it. So, can you talk about both whiteness and whiteness studies as principalities? I don't know a lot about whiteness and whiteness studies. I have a little understanding. Once, I was, in fact, talking to a friend of mine. He's an elder here. He's an African-American man. He's been doing some reading about the history of slavery. Once someone made the decision that They could get away with perpetually holding in bondage people of African ancestry, and they wouldn't for people of European ancestry? Well, what was that? Well, enough of this happening creates a spirit of whiteness, like enough of what's happening within a high school creates a school spirit. And that principality and power reigns in this world. I'm terribly caught in the middle of this dilemma because whiteness is real. Read Malcolm X. So is blackness. These are spiritual entities that, to what degree they are off the shelf and older than humanity spirits participate in them, and to what degree they are products or influenced by human beings, I can't answer those questions, but they are real and they are powerful. And what's anybody who is disturbed at the international international mobbing around certain things certainly can't be blind to the power of spirits. Spirits possess us. Spirits possess a mob. And so the spirit possessing the herd of pigs and driving them into the water, how is that different from the spirit possessing a mob on an American city street that starts looting or throwing things at the police? And the crowd is participating in it, and individuals are participating. Individuals are influencing and being influenced by it. Whiteness is whiteness a lot different from nationalities and nationality spirits? No, I don't think so. They're historical. They're born of an age, but this is a level. I think hopefully what I've learned in the last number of months and thinking a lot about this is getting a better handle on this idea of spirits. But even as they get more real psychologically, there's no reason to suppose they're less real in some of the other ways that I was used to thinking about them when I'd read the Bible. Because I've seen enough in the third world and in Pentecostal circles to say, oh, there's a reality there, all right, that I suspect is far older than I am. But most of the history is older than I am, so why should I be surprised by that?
All right. Don't think I have, unless someone. Okay, Owen just said thank you for that. I don't think I have any more questions queued up. So.
Cool.
Till tomorrow.
Till tomorrow. So if you've.
Wait.
There was one more question above Owen.
Oh, yeah. All right. So, what is your opinion on the Gnostic and Whoa. I don't know how to say that. Aposifro? I don't know. You see that, right? It's in the questions for PVK. Oh, well, Animique. It's
Is it above or below Carlos's street picture?
Oh, it's down.
Okay.
Down. Unless someone wants to unmute and help me out here.
Apocryphal.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sometimes my brain just...
Yeah. No problem.
I've never seen that, so...
Oh, what is your opinion of the Gnostic and Apocryphal texts? They're texts. They to the degree that I understand Gnosticism, and Gnosticism is such a broad. My understanding of Gnosticism is it's a bias towards the immaterial. It's bigotry against the material. And so when I hear Christians say things like, well, Jesus makes us go to, if you die and you love Jesus, you go to heaven to be with Jesus when you die. And N.T. Wright swoops in and says, well, intermediate state, but the new heavens and the new earth. The answer to Gnosticism is God declaring that his creation is good. Now, there's all this Gnostic literature that has been uncovered, and I think it's of some scholarly value to get clues into the thought of the ancient world. Now, the apocryphal text, if you're meaning some of the intertestamental text, well, I'm by no means an expert on it, so I'll just give the answer that I was given, which was that these are good books to read, and to the degree that I have read them, and I've read through some of them, they're really a lot of fun. But the Protestant reformers said that they're not of the same quality of the canonical books, and maybe it's the bias that I was raised on the canonical books and with less attention given to the apocryphal books. I think there's some wonderful things in the apocryphal books, and they're worth reading, but I don't treat them as canon, so maybe that's helpful.
Maybe we'll go for a shorter question. On the question of text, what is your thought on church traditions, church traditions on the authorship of Paul's letters and books of Peter as well?
Second Peter is always a highly debated book. First Peter is debated as well, because all of those debates are based on our ignorance, and the debates in some ways arise out of a modernist mind about the canon, and almost always are questions we can't answer. Especially because we understand that using a scribe, and it seems that Paul used one, it very much seems like First Peter used one, and even the question of, you didn't bring up John, the Johannine corpus in the New Testament. That's where things get really interesting, because names were recycled. It's like asking about George Foreman. George Foreman saw to it that there's lots of George Foremans running around. So authorship is sort of a fun thing to deal with in biblical studies, but sort of what happened when that arrived at its peak was that Beveridge Childs came in and said, to one degree or another, the church has been dealing with the text as it's been given. And so finally, that's where we should put our focus. So let's imagine that, in the middle of the night, Andrew wrote an epistle and signed it with his brother's name. Or let's imagine that Mark is the disciple of Peter and recorded the sermons that Peter repeat and stories that Peter would preach again and again and again and again. Does it bother me that the book of Mark isn't named Peter, the gospel according to Peter? No. These are interesting questions, but I tend to just say I'm going to deal with the Bible as canon. And when I do start a series on a book, a good contemporary critical commentary will have these matters dealt with at the beginning of the commentary, authorship date, what have you. It's important, but we imagine that normal people read the Bible as if it were computer code. I've never found that to be the case. Jesus says, "Love your enemies." I'm really bad at it. It's not a hard command to understand, and it's Mark Twain's adage. It's not the parts of Scripture I don't understand that bothers me. It's the parts I do understand. They bother me because I'm so bad at being faithful. So.
All right. Brian just had another question. I know it's getting pretty close to
yeah, I have to keep that tonight because I've got to go home and have a council meeting and should have a little time. So.
All right. I'll ask Dave if he can stash that for tomorrow.
No, I can take a shot at it. I sometimes do better if I don't have as much time.
All right. So
you'll get better answers sometimes.
The question is, what secular media, movie, TV, book?
Well, Sans wrong.
Do you want to go for that one?
Well, okay. Sorry if this comes in late. I've been kind of paying attention to what Jonathan Peugeot has been doing, while also spending time listening to the systems theorists. Purpose of the question, I referred to the Game B people. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I know Peugeot wouldn't like to make this connection. Jonathan, I'd love to. If you're a YouTube personality that has a private life, you wind up having private conversations with people, things get tricky. Because I'm fairly certain that he would not like the comparison. Yeah, I think you're probably right. I wonder about your take on this. It seems to me like some good things could come out of common language between the two frameworks. I agree. Does it even? And this is sort of where, the diversity between myself and Peugeot and Peterson and Vervaeke sort of comes into play. I probably shouldn't put myself on the same category as those guys, but because I'm a Protestant, and so some of my sensitivities are different than his. He might be right. I might be wrong. I think I look at Game B. I saw that video from Rebel Wisdom, and boy, that was red meat. And I've just been so busy with other things, I haven't done a video on it this week. But boy, I want to talk about that video. This is religion. They are trying to save the world, and what makes me probably that encourages the mocker in me. It's like I look at Game B and I think, I have been working in this stuff all my life. You want to look at someone who could change the world? Look at Jesus Christ. And one of the things, Rebel Wisdom is really skittish about Christianity. And, I love David Fuller. But that's the IDW thing. And Peterson, again, is the only guy, in some ways, who isn't afraid of Jesus. And I think Rebel Wisdom and the Game people, they're afraid of Jesus. And they should be. Because you want to look at someone who changed the world, look at Jesus. And how did he change the world? Read Tom Holland. Yeah, I'll try and be quick here. All right. So which one's next? Brian N?
Yeah. The secular media. So what secular media has provided great and unexpected religious/spiritual insights for you?
Oh, that's such a hard question because good art is good art. I've, for years, because I had young children in the house, even though, I'd sign up for a new service and they'd give me HBO or something like that. And always lied to my children. No, we don't have that channel. They did that when they were young. No, we don't have, we don't have Cartoon Network. Even I just tuned it out of TiVo so they couldn't find it. Now my children are grown, and everybody was telling me to watch Westworld, and so now I've got HBO on my Roku. Yeah, there's some stuff in Westworld which is really powerful and important. I've been watching The Wire recently, and interesting, but Christians, some Christians shoot themselves in the foot when they try to do art because they don't they close the circle too quickly. And Jonathan Peugeot doesn't have that problem because he's an icon carver. But if you're a Christian filmmaker, yeah, it's how do you communicate deep public truths to the world instead of, yeah. So, I've been watching The Wire, but part of the problem I have with a lot of these HBO properties is that I do find the nudity and the elements that keep the rated R elements that keep Christians away from them. I do find them problematic, and it's often gratuitous. Breaking Bad was one of the best things offered up on television, and it managed to do it without. It had some gratuitous violence, but so I'm hesitant to offer. I'm hesitant to offer recommendations because they're difficult. So, truth be told, almost any good thing I'm watching or reading provides unexpected religious and spiritual insight for me. And you all will have to be the judge if any of that insight is helpful or helpful on a bigger scale. So, all right, I think we're going to have to call it an evening. So, again, thank you for coming. I hope this isn't a waste of your time. I feel a little embarrassed by it in some ways because so many of these questions are big and important and profound, and I feel my answers are unworthy. But if you find it profitable, then I'll try to do it, because I feel that all of you who have watched my videos and subscribed to my channels, and some of you have even supported me on Patreon and in other different ways, and your participation in the Discord server, I find all of that in many ways to be your generosity to the world. And so if these question and answer sessions are a way that I can give back to you, then I will try to do it. So thank you for coming. And as John Vervaeke always says, it's a great line, thank you for your time and attention. So, all right, I've got to skedaddle. I did record this. I don't know what I'll do with the recording. If you hear anybody on the server who wanted to hear the recording, or maybe, see, there's this recording chat thing, which I don't always check, because kind of your, I'd say if you talk about this, if other people in the Discord say, oh, shoot, I wanted to be there and I didn't get a chance to hear it, let me know. And as some of you said, I'll post it on, I'm figuring out ways now that I can post these things. I will post it probably unlisted. And then if a bunch of you say there's helpful things that should be shared more publicly, I can do that too. So let me know if you would have value in having access to the recording of this, and I'll make that happen. Okay, so just let me know. All right.